episodes of Government for the last 10 years, the most recent episode being 5 days prior, along with vomiting for the last 4 days.
Dr. Karthik, please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, Karthik.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, sir. Okay, so the patient's pain presented in right upper abdomen, each episode lasting around 10 to 15 days. This had an acute onset, dull aching in nature, moderate to severe in intensity, non-radiating and aggravated with food intake and relieved with analgesia. Along with multiple episodes of vomiting, which was non-projectile, bilious in nature, and followed food intake. There was no history of fever, chills and tigers, Ehlers discoloration of eyes or urine, hematemesis, melena, altered bowel habits, loss of appetite, anxiety, or
ऐसे नहीं, ऐसे
sleep. Within that, no significant past history. The person included a vegetarian diet, a normal appetite,
ऐसे
a
नहीं
regular sleep pattern, and normal bladder movement. There's no contributed mental or family history. A treatment history included her multiple visits to local practitioner for the same symptoms, which was always managed symptomatically and had no improvements. On general physical examination, we have a moderately built and healthy patient with a BMI of 18.2, vital stable, and on general head-to-toe examination, pallor and ictus was present. A local examination of abdomen was unremarkable except for the right hypochondrial tenderness. She had a normal systemic examination. Summarizing my case, we have a 18-year-old girl who presented with recurrent episodes of abdomen for the last 10 years, since without any improvement in symptoms. Most recent episode being 5 days prior, associated with non-projectile bilious episodes of vomiting, having no known comorbidities or previous abdominal surgical intervention. On examination, had ictus and right hypochondrial tenderness. With the provisional diagnosis of acute cholecystitis and choledocholithiasis, and the differentials of acute relapse in pancreatitis, choledochal cyst with cholangitis, and peptic ulcer disease, we proceeded to the radiodiagnostic investigations. I would now request Dr. from Department of Radiodiagnosis to discuss the radiological aspect of the case.
Good morning to all of you.
Good morning, Dr. Ishant. Please proceed.
So, ultrasound had showed that there is dilatation of intrahepatic biliary radicals, and for that, CT was performed from an outside institute, I think. So there is a cystic lesion in vicinity of yeah. So there was bilobar dilatation of intrahepatic biliary radicals, and I will request the resident to please show the findings. And so there is a cystic lesion in the hepatic hilum, and since this is non-contrast CT, this is difficult to distinguish between a pancreatic lesion or a lesion arising from CBD. So MRI was performed. So next slide, please. So in MRI, we can appreciate that there is cystic dilatation of common bile duct in this region, and this is communicating with dilated left-sided intrahepatic biliary radicals, and this is a fusiform dilatation not associated with any distal stricture or any distal calculus in CBD. Also, we can appreciate that there is diffuse gallbladder wall edema. So the stratification of the gallbladder wall is maintained. So we can see a dark mucosal lining followed by T2 hyperintense submucosal lining. So next slide, please. So this again shows dilated CBD, which is communicating with dilated left-sided IHBR. So overall, so there was no anomalous union of pancreatic duct and CBD. The common channel was less than 1.5 centimeter. So the diagnosis is type 4 choledochal cyst with, and GB showed multiple small soft calculi. So choledochal cyst with cholelithiasis and cholecystitis. So you can proceed to your case.
Thank you, sir. Patient's biochemical parameters on presentation revealed patient to be anemic with HB of 8.5, total low lymphocyte count and platelet counts, and a deranged LFT. Our SGOT and SGPT being 189 and 259 respectively. a raised total bilirubin of 9.6 and direct bilirubin of 7.3 milligram per deciliter. She also had a raised alkaline phosphatase of 438 units per liter and a low total protein of 5.7 and total albumin of 2.6 grams per liter. With the final diagnosis of type 4A choledochal cyst with cholecystitis and choledocholithiasis, this diagram representing the anatomical variation in type 4A choledochal cyst with a dilated CBD, extrahepatic biliary radical, and multiple dilated intrahepatic biliary radicals. We proceeded with the plan of surgical excision of choledochal cyst with cholecystectomy, followed by Roux-en-Y hepaticojejunostomy, and we prepared the patient by correction of anemia, hypoproteinemia, and prothrombin time with adequate hydration and carbohydrate loading and prophylactic antibiotic. Intraoperatively, we found a 3.5 into 4.2 centimeter choledochal cyst, mildly dilated right and left hepatic ducts, and the cuff of normal common hepatic duct being 0.5 centimeter in length, present below the confluence, with smooth tapering of lower end GB extending to retrodural part of the GB. A GB was full of sludge with 1 centimeter calculi felt in the tapering part of the lower end of CBD, and dense adhesions were seen around radicals and porta region. The final surgery being done was excision of cholecystitis with cholecystectomy, followed by Roux-en-Y hepaticojejunostomy under general anesthesia. Postoperatively, patient had an unremarkable course until POD grade 2 with serosanguinous Ryle's tube and in output approximately 100 ml. Output increased to 500 ml in nature on the evening of postoperative day 5, along with 2 episodes of hematemesis, and her HB dropped down to 9 on postoperative day 5 compared to initial 11.1 on the postoperative day 1. USG abdomen revealed ill-defined heterogeneous collection approximately 25 ml adjacent to the anastomotic site. Uh, Due to the increasing serosanguinous rate and decreasing HB, the patient was re-explored for the suspected intraperitoneal bleed. On re-exploration, it was found the patient had blood clots present in subhepatic 50 ml biliary collection of hepatic space. There was a complete anastomotic dehiscence. The upper arrows showing the hepatic end of the anastomosis and the lower arrow showing the jejunal end of the anastomosis. This is an intact Roux-en-Y. So the redo surgery, we did hepaticojejunostomy refashioned over the transanastomotic stent under general anesthesia. This is the stent which was over the anastomotic site. Patient had a relative uneventful postoperative stay in that for the first 3 days. Then patient was shifted to ward. The postoperative parameters revealed her LFT to be slightly deranged, but gross improvement from the initial values. The patient was orally allowed on postoperative day 3, which she tolerated well. Her biliary stent drainage initially around 200 ml per day decreased gradually to 20 to 30 ml per day postoperative day 6 onwards. And patient was discharged with stent and subhepatic drain in situ on postoperative 10. Choledochal cyst is a congenital dilatation at any portion of biliary tree, a rare entity seen as one case per 100,000 to 150,000 live births. 75% of diagnosed in and 20% of cases in the adults. It's more commonly seen in women than men, and adults present with symptomatic gall and acute cholecystitis, both attributing to biliary stasis. Biliary malignancy is seen in 10 to 30% of cases cases. The most widely accepted classification was reported by Torani and colleagues in 1997. These describe the anatomical variation seen in the choledochal cyst. A type 1 choledochal cyst usually involves a saccular fusiform or cystic dilatation of the extrahepatic biliary tree. And type 2 is usually a diverticular in the extrahepatic part of the biliary tree. And type 3 is usually involves a dilatation of intraduodenal part of the CBD. As in our case, 4A cyst having both intrahepatic and extrahepatic involvement. A type 4B cyst usually have multiple cystic dilatation in the extrahepatic biliary trees, and a type 4 cyst, a type 5 cyst usually have multiple dilatation involving only the intrahepatic tree. I now Professor R.N. Meena sir to continue the discussion of this case and conclude the presentation.
So finally, after re-explorations, we have looked that plot is present and the complete dehiscence of hepaticogenos. So after refreshening of the both end, then the hepaticogenostomy over putting a stent on the left side of the hepatic duct. And so as shown in the diagram also, they have after that refreshening of the hepatic end and the jejunal end and putting the infant feeding of 6 French on the left hepatic duct, and over it we have done the rehepaticogenesis. So the bilioenteric anastomosis, so what make it is perilous is that it is the tension correction at the margins that is the very important. So the excessive dissection at porta, damaging the peritoneum, extensive distortions and the variations of the blood supply, that is very important for the anastomosis point of view. So the take home message is that the early diagnosis and the intervention of bilioenteric anastomotic leak it decrease the morbidity and the mortality of the patients. So the bilioenteric anastomosis safety tips is that it always you can consider is the trans anastomotic stent when you are in doubt or when they will be having any pressure over the anastomotic point of view, and prefer 2-layer anastomosis if possible, and you have always support the jejunal end towards the peritoneal sides so that there will be less hanging and less pressure on the anastomotic sides, and you have to preserve the blood supply of the margins. So usually the upper end is you have to carefully dissect and preserve the upper end marginal branches for the blood supply for the proper anastomosis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karthik and Dr. Meena, for the good presentation and sticking to the time. And now we'll start taking questions on the chat box. And first question is from Dr. Vivek Srivastava, and I request him to unmute himself and ask this question.
Hello.
Am
I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I have got two questions. One is that what was done for the intrahepatic cyst, or what will be the future plan regarding the intrahepatic component of the type 4 choledochal cyst? And second is what was the exact cause for hematemesis? Because the anastomotic leak or bleeding in a roux I hepaticogenostomy may not explain this hematemesis episode. So what was the cause for that?
So the
So you're muted, sir.
Hello.
So this question
Did
actually
you hear
incomplete.
my
You
question?
pointed out rightly for 4A cyst because there is an intrahepatic component. Now, if this intrahepatic component is localized to one ductal system, the right ductal system or the left ductal system, then we would need to combine it with the liver resection to achieve a complete clearance. But if it is involving both the ductal system, right and the left system, then a complete liver excision with the hepatectomy with the liver transplant is required, which is an extremely major procedure. As such, we are leaving because we've not tackled the intrahepatic ductal system, so the patient will be prone for the complication of malignancy later on in life. But we've removed the extrahepatic choledochal cyst, so the chances of getting a malignancy later on will be reduced, but not completely eliminated. because the intrahepatic ductal system, which is dilated and involved, could be still prone to malignancy. Regarding the second point, like if there is a, like normally what we do, we need to diagnose a leak early, and what we wait for is a bilious discharge or a entry content discharge from the drain side, and then we start thinking of the possibility of a leak occurring from the anastomotic side. But in the biliary enteric anastomosis, it is most frequently a sanguineous discharge from the drain, which heralds the leak. So even if we get a sanguineous discharge starts coming in from the third or fourth day from the in the drain, then we should always suspect that a leak has occurred, the anastomosis is given way, and our treatment decision should be made accordingly. The same thing, because of the anastomotic disruption, there's probably bleeding from the margins, and that can go in the rule loop and be vomited out, and that is the cause of hematopoiesis probably in this patient.
So it's very unusual that the blood will collect in the proximal jejunum, go into the duodenum, then cross the pyloric sphincter and come into the stomach, and then to vomit out. My point is that was the endoscopy done in this patient before exploration, just to rule out any other concomitant cause?
No, we did not do that. Endoscopy was not done. And now,
Thank you.
second question is from Dr. Deepa Gautam. So, will you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, I think looking at possibility of in cases of complication, looking at possibility for need for liver transplant, was the patient counseled for it? Because I mean, sensitization of the patient for such things is important at this very stage only.
Yes, honestly, patient was not counseled for that. Okay, so that part was not treated. That's a procedure which we need to see whether the patient would be able to actually arrange for that procedure or not.
Yeah.
Patient needs
Cost.
to see a lot of arrangement, not just the cost, the donor part also. Where is the donor thing going to come from? And the patient needs to go to New Delhi for that. And whether the patient has the capability of going to New Delhi for getting that transplant done, and then stay there for a few months there, arrange for the donor, and the financial thing is always there at the back of our mind. So, considering that all those things, the patient was actually not counseled for that. We'll go to the next question from Professor A.K. Khanna. So, will you please unmute yourself? Sir, Professor A.K. Khanna, will you, sir, please unmute yourself, ask your question? What will be the fate of the intrahepatic component of the cyst? Professor Khanna has asked. So, Dr. Meena, would you like to answer this question?
The intrahepatic, what will be the fate of the intrahepatic? We have already told that if you patient can be affordable, we have to counsel for the liver transplant, and you can wait and watch, because extrahepatic we have removed, so there is less chance of cholangiocarcinoma is there. But intrahepatic we have to observe that. That is, in patient will be kept in follow-up, and you can counsel for the further liver transplant if the complications develop.
It's actually a very valid question that Professor Khanna has asked. One is the possibility of cholangiocarcinoma. So that will always be there at the back of the mind. Other than that, there's also the possibility of secondary biliary cirrhosis, because these directed intrahepatic cysts, they be prone for bile stagnation and infection also, always throughout the patient life, because she's a young patient, after all, 18 years old only. And there will be always the chance that she can develop secondary biliary cirrhosis later on, and she'll always also be prone to cholangitis. Of course, the risk of pancreatitis has been eliminated as long as the extrahepatic duct has been tackled. So the risk of pancreatitis is not there now. But the risk of cholangitis, secondary biliary cirrhosis, and cholangiocarcinoma, they will continue to be there. But then on the other hand, the procedure involved for treating the intrahepatic ductal system, especially if it is involving both sides, is such a radical procedure that I don't think any center offers the treatment of the intrahepatic cyst at all. Professor Khanna has joined. Now I request him to ask his question or make his comments. Sir, will you please unmute yourself and make your comments? Sir, you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you. Sir, sir, you
Rahul?
can't. Yeah, now we can hear you, sir. Now we can hear you. Yes.
No, I just wanted to know in this patient, we have been doing the hepatocytosis, so many cases which has been done.
Mhm.
If there's a leak is there, it usually occurs about 5 to 7 days after that, and not within 24 to 48 hours.
Mhm.
So if there's a leak in within 24 to 48 hours is there, it means there is some technical fault which has occurred there. And as Dr. Meena said, that you do a double layer anastomosis. Double layer is usually not done for the hepatocytosis. It is always a single layer which is done. That is a standard of care. Jejunum has got a very good blood supply, and the upper part of the hepatic duct which is there, that also has got a good blood supply. So usually not because of that it occurs. So I think probably in this patient, what has happened is there is some technical fault which has occurred right at the time of the operation itself. And one of the reason which I think in that probably while you are coming out of the operation, something has been pulled up at that time. Maybe because there's a mop is there and mop is kept and mop, you just
Mhm.
pull it out and there's a disruption because of that. Because you cannot explain all these things just by your anastomosis that it has occurred disrupted within 24 to 48 hours. So that is a concern in the patient probably which has occurred.
Okay, sir. It's a very valid
As
point
you,
you
as,
made.
as you rightly said about intrahepatic ducts, it has been seen if there's a combined component is there, that cholangitis become less if you treat the extra hepatic component. Though the chance of having the biliary lithiasis which is there or the carcinoma in the liver itself, it is there, but that cholangitis element becomes less if you treat the external component. The treatment for the type 4 Rodani which is there is to do a liver transplantation. That is the ideal thing which has to be done. Thank you.
Sir, I'll repeat the course. What you said, your points are very valid, and I thank you for making those points. Actually, we noticed the sanguineous discharge on the 5th day, not within 24 hours. The sanguineous discharge in the brain was noted on the 5th day, and that alerted us. That immediately suggested sanguineous discharge is one of the harbingers that anastomosis is probably given away. And we did not even wait for bile to appear in the drains. We did not wait for that at all. Or just on the basis of blood in the drainage tube, VG explored the patient within 24 hours of that, next day only, on the 6th day actually. And it was noted on the 5th day. And complete disruption of the anastomosis was found. And it was the earlier anastomosis, like what you said, I'll repeat what Dr. Meena had said. Why did this anastomosis give way? That's a very important, valid question. And the point you made are very relevant, that the vascularity is usually good at that point. But then there are certain other points that we need to keep into mind. There are two things which are very cardinal for an anastomosis. One is that we should not have tension or traction on the anastomosis. That is one. And the second thing is we should achieve a good vascularity at the margins. The third, that is rightly pointed out, is equally important, that the technical aspect of the anastomosis, the choice of suture material, all should be correct for that particular situation. Now, coming to the first point, now this rule loop of jejunum actually hangs on the anastomosis. When the patient is in a sitting position or standing position, the rule loop actually drags on the anastomosis. So there's a considerable amount of traction at a biliary enteric or biliary or a hepatico-jejunal anastomosis of the rule loop variety when the patient is in a standing position. And actually, I was also under the impression that most of the hepatico-jejunostomy anastomosis are single layer. But a two layer has actually been described and has been found to be better. And the outer layer takes the peritoneum, the investing peritoneum all around the bile duct, that is taken in the outer layer. So what actually happens when we are actually dissecting the cortical cyst, then we got to we usually push the peritoneum out with a push to get to the upper neck of the colorectal cyst. And stripping the peritoneum out actually takes away the blood supply also. So the cut margins at the upper end might not be as vascular as it appears just because the peritoneum has been stripped off. And the second point regarding the vascular, so that is one thing that that we should try to do a 2-layer or at least take what are called as hitching stitches at the both corners. So these hitch stitches at the both corners will take up the weight of the jejunum and avoid traction at the actual anastomosis. So either 2-layer or hitch stitches should always be preferred just to take the weight of traction of the jejunal loop of the anastomosis. The second point, getting a good vascular margins at the cut end, that is equally important. One is that we need to preserve the peritoneum over the cut end or the proximal end. Secondly, now we should always keep in mind that we are actually leaving the intrahepatic ducts behind. So we should try to preserve at least a ½ centimeter cuff below the confluence. So that cuff actually makes the technical part of the anastomosis easier, and also gives a good place where you can anchor your loop. The third thing is that we should, while excising the colorectal cyst, we should take special care to notice the vascular anomalies if they are present, especially regarding the hepatic artery. Now, vascular anomalies of the hepatic artery is something which are not going to be reported on any pre-operative investigation, including ultrasound or CT scan or MRI. We might do all three, but if there is a vascular anomaly, none of the three are going to report that. That is something that we can only see during the operation, especially if we've got facility for indocyanine green infusion, then it can be easily seen, because it is very likely that if the right hepatic artery is in an anomalous position, it can be anterior or it can be posterior, it can be on the right of the colorectal cyst, it can be on the left of the colorectal, anywhere. Then we might mistake it for a cystic artery and ligate it entirely. And that although it might not manifest with the liver derangement later on, but it might compromise the blood supply of the proximal stump of the bile duct. So these are the 2 points I wish to make. And now I'll move to the next question. And now I'll request Professor Ashok Kumar to unmute himself and ask the question.
I think some of the points have already been answered. This question to the resident doctor: what are the long-term complications of colorectal cyst? And if I remember correctly, the patient had low platelet count. So could it have contributed to bleeding complications? Thank you.
Yes, sir. The main long-term complications in colorectal cyst will either be a cholangitis, patient presenting with cholangitis, or the main thing which we watch out for is probably the malignancy, sir. And regarding the low platelet count, it could have contributed to the bleeding, but sir, we had corrected it pre-operatively, sir. Both the anemia component of the patient and the low platelet count, we had corrected it pre-operatively. And since the patient also had a deranged LFT, we had supplemented with vitamin K and FFP transfusions also before we took up to the OT.
So we're coming to the end of this time, but we'll take a last question from Professor Puneet from Department of Surgery.
Hello.
Puneet, yes, Dr. Can you be brief?
Yes, sir. I hope that Dr. A.K. Khanna has answered all the questions which I want to emphasize, and he too have covered the things which I want to cover it. I think he has done so, because even I was in the opinion that it is impossible to have a so early dehiscence of anastomosis, and if it is ischemia, it takes time, and it happens quite early in this patient. So in my opinion, it's all happened because of the reason that probably has some technical fault which has happened during surgical intervention when the patient had this anastomotic dehiscence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now we've come to 8:31, so we'll finish this presentation right now, and we'll go to medicine department where Dr. Deepak Gautam has already joined us. And I hand over to Dr. Deepak Gautam, who will introduce the speaker to us.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Ravichand, who is our JR2, will be presenting the case. I request Dr. Ravichand to proceed with the presentation.
Dr. Ravicharan hails from Hyderabad, and he's done his MBBS from Osmania Middle College.
Yes, sir.
Please
Thank
try
you.
to start his presentation. Stick to the time.
Good morning, all the respected teachers and my dear colleagues. I am Ravichand on behalf of Unit 4 Department of General Medicine, and my today's presentation is mentored by Professor Deepak Gautam and Dr. D.P. Yadav from Department of Gastroenterology. Case scenario. A 38-year-old housewife, resident of Chandauli, came with chief complaints of yellowish discoloration of eyes and urine for 6 months, skin rash for 3 months, abdominal distension for 1 month. History of present illness. Patient was apparently all right 6 months back when she developed yellowish discoloration of eyes for 6 months, insidious onset, progressive, associated with yellowish discoloration of urine, pruritus, more on palms and soles and at night, and clay-colored stools, also associated with low-grade fever, which was never recorded without any diurnal variation or chills, and relieved on taking oral antipyretics. No history of pain abdomen. Generalized skin rash for 3 months. Insidious in onset, she first noticed button-sized red raised lesions on front of both arms and forearms. They gradually progressed to involve both lower limbs, abdomen, upper and lower back, and face. Abdominal distension for 1 month. Progressive in nature, later involved both lower limbs and then face. Associated with difficulty in breathing, which is slightly relieved in sitting position. No history of cough, no history suggestive of PND, no history of frothy urine and decreased urine output. History of anorexia and fatigue present. History of oral ulceration and hair loss present. No history of joint pain. No history suggestive of hematemesis and melena. No past history of blood transfusion, tattooing, and high risk behavior. No history of recent travel or contact with a person with jaundice. Past history. History of hypothyroidism, diagnosed 5 years back. Patient was taking oral thyroxine 50 microgram. No history of diabetes, hypertension, tuberculosis or ATT intake, or contact with a person with tuberculosis. No history of any surgical intervention in the past. Family history. No similar history in the family. Personal history. Patient takes mixed diet, altered sleep-wake cycle for last 2 weeks, constipation for last 2 weeks, no history of alcohol intake or usage of tobacco products, menstrual and obstetric history. Amenorrhea for 6 months. Last menstrual period is on 15th April 2020. 2 live births, healthy, 1 through spontaneous vaginal delivery, another through LSCS. No history of fetal loss present. Treatment history. History of hypothyroidism, diagnosed 5 years back. Patient is on tablet L-Troxin 50 microgram once daily. Before being admitted with us, she received treatment by a local practitioner and at district hospital for 3 days. Exact medication not known. Provisional diagnosis based on history. My diagnosis based on history will be chronic liver disease, probably cirrhosis with decompensation, ascites and hepatic encephalopathy are the decompensating features. As the patient is a middle-aged female having intrahepatic cholestatic pattern of jaundice and history is suggestive of autoimmune disorder, my differentials for etiology will be autoimmune hepatitis or its variants, that is autoimmune hepatitis with PBC overlap, autoimmune hepatitis with PSC overlap, and autoimmune hepatitis with unexplained cholestasis. Second, primary biliary cirrhosis and primary sclerosing cholangitis. Third, drug-induced liver injury. Fourth, chronic viral hepatitis with a possibility of SLE overlap. On general examination, patient was oriented to time, place, and person, moderately built and nourished, lying in supine position. Pulse rate 98 per minute, regular, normal in volume, character, no radio-radial or radiofemoral delay. All peripheral pulses were palpable. Blood pressure 102/68 millimeters of mercury in right arm supine position. Respiratory rate is 20 per minute and patient is afebrile. Pallor absent, icterus present, cyanosis and clubbing were absent. Pedal edema was present, pitting type. JVP is normal. Lymphadenopathy was absent. Stigmata of chronic liver disease could not be appreciated in the patient. Diffuse hyperpigmentation of the skin is seen. Other cutaneous findings: multiple round erythematous plaques of variable size ranging from 0.5 into 1 centimeter to 1 into 2 centimeter are seen on anterior aspect of thigh. These plaques have a central violaceous and dark zone which is surrounded by lighter erythematous zone, suggestive of erythema multiforme like lesions. My cutaneous findings are confirmed with Department of Dermatology. On systemic examination, on cardiovascular examination, S1, S2 sounds heard, no additional sounds heard. On CNS examination, patient is conscious and oriented with a GCS of 15. Respiratory system examination, bilateral vesicular breath sounds present, no other adventitious sounds heard. On per-abdomen examination, inspection, abdomen is looking distended with full flange. Umbilicus is everted, central and transverse. All quadrants of abdomen are moving proportionately with respiration. A 10 centimeter midline scar presents below the umbilicus. No visible veins present on abdomen and on back. No visible peristalsis or pulsation present. All the inguinal sites are intact. On superficial palpation, temperature is not raised, non-tender, no rigidity or guarding present, fluid thrill present. On deep palpation could not be performed on the patient. On percussion, dull note all over the abdomen heard. On auscultation, normal bowel sounds heard. Per rectal examination is normal. Investigations. The baseline investigations are from April 2020 and patient presented to us in October on October 20th. The baseline hemoglobin is 12 and on presentation it is 11.7 and it is at an average is at around 10 to 11. The baseline total leukocyte count is 11,000 and on presentation it is 19,000, which is raised. N/L ratio is 70/23. Platelet count is at the lower range of normal, around 1.2 lakhs. The average MCV over the course of disease is 82. This slide depicts liver function test over the course of the disease. The baseline is from April and the patient presented to us in October. The baseline OTPT is 61/65 and on presentation it is 305/274, which is 10 times elevated. And as we can see, there is persistent transaminitis all over the course of the disease. The baseline total bilirubin and direct bilirubin is 3.9/2.7 and on presentation it is 41/23, which is approximately 30 to 40 times elevated. This pattern is suggestive of conjugated hyperbilirubinemia and cholestatic pattern of disease. Total protein by albumin at baseline is 6.8/3.7 and on presentation it is 7.2/2.9 with AG reversal can be seen here. Alkaline phosphatase is persistently elevated more than 2 times over the course of the disease. Gamma GT is also elevated. PTINR is 26.4/2.18, which is suggestive of coagulopathy. Baseline creatinine in April is 0.7 and urea is 19 and on presentation it is 1.9/43, suggesting the renal pattern of AKI on presentation. On diagnostic ascitic tab, total leukocyte count is 15 cells per cubic millimeter. N/L ratio is 20/80. Total protein in ascites is 1.15 gram per deciliter. Albumin is 0.9 gram per deciliter. Corresponding serum albumin is 2.6 gram per deciliter. SAG comes out to be 1.7, which is high SAG ascites with total ascitic protein less than 2.5. Ultrasound abdomen and color Doppler hepatoportal venous system. Coarsened liver echo texture with irregular surface measuring 12.16 centimeter, suggestive of chronic liver disease. Portal vein is prominent, which is 13.6 millimeter with decreased velocity 11.4 centimeter per second, but hepatopetal flow. Gross ascites noted, spleen measured 12.7 centimeters. Hepatic veins show maintained flow. Hepatic arteries show normal color flow with high resistivity index, that is 1.07, suggestive of resistance flow. No extra or intrahepatic biliary radical dilatation noted. Right kidney measured 11.1 into 4.8 centimeter. Left kidney measured 12.3 into 5 centimeter with normal corticomedullary differentiation and cortical thickening with slightly raised echo texture. Blood culture is sterile. Serum procalcitonin is within normal limit. Urine routine microscopy showed traces of albumin, slightly raised RBC 12 to 15. 24-hour urinary protein is 350 milligram per day. As a history of patient is suggestive of an autoimmune disorder, we conducted some serological tests in the patient, out of which ANA came positive with endpoint titer 1:80, anti-dsDNA came positive, anti-Smith and antihistone antibodies came negative, C3, C4 are within normal limits, anti-TPO came negative, RA factor came out to be positive. Based on the clinical and above serological findings, patient was diagnosed as having SLE with EULAR score 14. Patient is also satisfying the criteria for Rowell syndrome, with the major criteria for it are presence of SLE, along with erythema multiforme like lesions and ANA positivity, and minor criteria positive in our case is a positive rheumatoid factor. 3 major criteria and 1 minor criteria is required to diagnose this syndrome. My diagnosis is confirmed with the Department of Dermatology. We've conducted further investigations to find out the etiology of cirrhosis. Lipid profile is normal. To rule out Wilson's, KF ring is absent. Serum ceruloplasmin and 24-hour urinary copper are within normal limits. Chronic viral markers suggestive of HIV 1 and 2 are negative. Hepatitis HBsAg and anti-HBsIg, HBV DNA for hepatitis B are negative. Anti-HCV and HCV RNA for hepatitis C were negative. Autoimmune liver profile. M2 and PDC antibodies suggestive of anti-mitochondrial antibodies were positive. F-actin antibodies suggestive of anti-smooth muscle antibodies were positive. ANA is positive. IgA anti-TTG is negative. Serum total IgG is elevated more than 1.1 times. Upper GI endoscopy is suggestive of 2-column grade 2 varices, 3-column grade 1 varices, portal hypertensive gastropathy, duodenum is normal study. Further plan of investigation, percutaneous liver biopsy is advised for the patient, but as there is coagulopathy and ascites, transjugular liver biopsy was advised. At that point of time, we are not performing transjugular liver biopsy in our institute, and as it is a costly procedure, patient could not afford it outside. My final diagnosis is based on history, examination, and investigation. Cirrhosis, etiology of cirrhosis is autoimmune hepatitis and PBC overlap, with portal hypertension, non-bleeder with grade 2 varices, with decompensation, and the decompensating features are ascites without SBP, hepatic encephalopathy, grade 1 according to West Haven grading. Child-Pugh patient comes under Child-Pugh class C with score 13, and MEL sodium score is 37. With systemic lupus erythematosus, EULAR score 14 with Rowell syndrome, with primary hypothyroidism, with AKI, which is most probably due to sepsis induced. Cause for sepsis is not found. The most probable explanation is patient was admitted in outside district hospital for 3 days and was given antibiotics there. Treatment. Combination therapy as endorsed by EASL for autoimmune hepatitis PBC overlap was started. Prednisolone 60 mg daily dose tapered over 1 month to 20 mg daily maintenance phase is used to treat autoimmune hepatitis component. For primary biliary cirrhosis component, oral ursodeoxycholic acid 15 mg per kg, that is 300 mg TDS is used. Hydroxychloroquine 300 mg once daily for lupus erythematosus was given. Thyroxine 75 micrograms daily for primary hypothyroidism is given. Low salt diet is advised. Injectable antibiotics, broad spectrum antibiotics were given for sepsis. Oral rifaximin lactulose for hepatic encephalopathy with a target of 2 to 3 soft stools per day. Oral diuretics for ascites and non-selective beta blockers for primary prophylaxis of varices were started after resolution of AKI. Azathioprine was planned to start after 2 weeks. Referral for liver transplantation was done after explaining the risks and benefits and cost for liver transplant. The following parameters were monitored. After giving the treatment for 1 week, we can see the transaminitis subsided with OT by PT 121 by 73. Total bilirubin by direct bilirubin is also subsided from 40 by 30 to 12 by 8.2. And creaturia is also settled with 0.6 by 32 after giving antibiotics for 4 to 5 days, suggesting that it might be due to sepsis. These were the skin lesions which subsided after giving treatment as the treatment for Rowell syndrome is also immunosuppression and hydroxychloroquine. Discussion. Autoimmune hepatitis and primary biliary cirrhosis overlap. Overlap syndromes occur in 3 to 7% of patients with autoimmune liver disease. Overlap syndromes present with both hepatic and cholestatic pattern of liver function tests. Neither the diagnostic criteria nor the treatment strategy for this variant of PBC is standardized owing to the low prevalence. Paris criteria. Paris criteria for diagnosing PBC and autoimmune hepatitis overlap syndrome. A diagnosis of PBC AH overlap syndrome requires meeting at least 2 of the 3 accept criteria for each condition. For PBC, our patient met the first 2 criteria, that is elevated serum alkaline phosphatase level greater than 2 times of the upper limit of normal, positive test for anti-mitochondrial antibody. For the autoimmune hepatitis criteria, our patient met the first criteria, which is elevated alanine aminotransferase level greater than 5 times of upper limit of normal, and a positive test for anti-smooth muscle antibody. Although liver biopsy is not performed using this criteria, we can probably diagnose the variant syndrome. Treatment for autoimmune hepatitis and PBC overlap. Diagnosing an overlap syndrome has therapeutic implications. Immunosuppression is considered as the standard effective therapy for autoimmune hepatitis. Ursodeoxycholic acid and obeticholic acid is recommended to slow down the progression of PBC. End-stage disease needs liver transplantation. Early diagnosis and intervention of this condition are required for better outcome of the patient. Liver transplantation. In Indian scenario, cirrhosis accounts for 20 per 1 lakh population, according to the WHO Global Health Observatory data. 2 lakh deaths due to liver failure or liver cancer annually, among which 10 to 15% of which can be rescued by transplant. Around liver annually, only 100 are being performed. Liver majority are being done.
All pending have requested to mute themselves so that we can hear the presenter. Please mute yourself. Now, please go ahead, Dr. Ravi. And how many slides you got, Ravi, left now?
Yes, sir, it's almost done, sir. Last slide, sir.
Okay.
Majority
Finish within 2 minutes, okay?
Yes, sir. Majority of the liver transplants are being done by private sector, with the public sector lagging behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi. Now I request Dr. Deepak Gautam, followed by Dr. Devesh Yadav, to make the comments, and then we'll go to the questions.
So I request Dr. Anand to ask his question.
Good morning. Actually, it was replied by Deepak sir already in the chat, but this is for the resident, means whether it is just if it is these exercises are for the training purposes. So I just want to ask Ravi whether the icterus or ascites or fidelidema or nasarca, can it be considered as a stigmata of chronic disease or not?
Sir, icterus, sir.
Icterus and ascites. With ascites.
They are not stigmata of chronic liver disease, sir. They are the decompensating features of chronic liver disease, cirrhosis.
Dr. Ravi, is there any difference between sign, symptoms, and stigmata? What is the meaning of stigmata, you know? So they are the signs of chronic liver disease, but stigmata is something which is a suppository. Okay, it may not be there with other signs, but if they are present, you should suspect that CLD is there.
Okay.
So like Palmer erythema is a subtle sign or a hidden sign of CLD. So stigmata and signs are a little different.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Now I request Dr. Sanjeev Gupta sir has asked a question that the investigations were done inside or outside. As far as I remember, this case is almost 1 year old. The ANA was done inside, but the autoimmune panel was done outside because all of them were not available inside, sir.
Okay. It must have been fairly expensive, very extensively worked up case.
So the panel is almost 4,000 or 5,000 only nowadays.
Achha, okay. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
So I request, thanks, sir. I request Dr. Ishan Kumar to ask his question. About triphasic CT has asked. Kindly unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sir, one of the important component of management of cirrhosis is to rule out malignancy. But since there is a fairly high chances of hepatocellular carcinoma in these cases. So why triphagic CT was not done?
So
to
triphagic
rule
CT
out
was not required. I hope Dr. Devesh can answer this question better than me.
Actually, we are not performing triphagic CT or contrast MRI in all the patients of liver cirrhosis. We first screen the patients for SCC with alpha fetoprotein or PIVKA2 and ultrasonography. Because triphagic CT is costing around 5,500 in our setup, and its costly return cannot be done in all patients of cirrhosis. We are seeing so many cases of cirrhosis. I agree that SCC is more prevalent in cases of cirrhosis and needs to be ruled out, but we are doing only ultrasound and alpha fetoprotein. If we have high index of suspicion of SCC, then we go for triphagic CT in these patients. Because if you did a triphagic CT scan, it is normal. And then again, you need to screen the patient after 6 months. Then CT cannot be repeated every 6 months, and ultrasound and AFP can be repeated safely. So we don't do CT in all the patients of compensated or decompensated cirrhosis routinely.
When the patient presented to us, Dr. Ishan, the creatinine was also raised.
AFP was raised.
Yeah. What was the AFP in the follow-up of these patients? Alpha fetoprotein, like you pointed out, the CT is not feasible very regularly. AFP is probably raised in cirrhosis also, isn't it? Alpha fetoprotein.
Raised AFP is strongly suggestive of hepatocellular carcinoma. So I think triphagic CT would be next step.
It is raised in cirrhosis also, isn't it?
Raised AFP says that there is ongoing replication. So AFP is highly elevated in SCC, but it can also be found when liver is regenerating. If patient is recovering, AFP can be high.
So is there any criteria to do triphagic CT to rule out whether these nodules are dysplastic or malignant?
If you are buying any SOL on ultrasound, then triple phase CT is must. But if creatinine is deranged, you can go for MRI. You can at least see diffusion weighted and T1, T2 images on MRI without contrast.
Yes, that can be done.
So, if there
Dr.
any
Shubham
more
Kumar
question or comment?
ask a question. Dr. Shubham Kumar Gupta.
Yes, Dr. Shubham, kindly unmute yourself and ask your question.
ये मेरे जैसे इज्जत किसी को नहीं मिलता। तो
Sir, good morning everyone.
देखो ओडिया जो करता है कि जो को मालूम नहीं चोरी छिपे करता है, वो सोच रहा है कि वो हार्म करने का कोशिश कर रहा है मेरे को, ठीक है। वो जो है सो अथॉरिटी से जो है मेरे को कुछ एक्शन करवाने की कोशिश कर रहा है, बस वही है।
Sir, some of you have unmuted yourself and we are taking your discussion. We are listening to please unmute yourself.
Please.
Yeah, please mute. Everybody, please mute yourself. Only those who are asking questions or make comments, they should unmute yourself. So now we'll, Dr. Shubham, can you ask your question now? Dr. Shubham.
Good morning, everyone.
Yes.
In this slide based on history, how hepatic encephalopathy was made, sir, in the history, I did not find anything which was suggestive of encephalopathy. And as the
Dr. Shubham, can you, your voice is not coming clearly. Can you speak a little louder or come closer to your device?
Dr. Shubham.
Sir, in the history,
yes.
No.
If you can recall, the sleep-wake cycle was disturbed. Okay. The sleep-wake cycle of the patient was disturbed. Okay. And that constitutes grade 1 of hepatic encephalopathy. In most of the grades, West Haven as well as Wrigley's, that constitutes grade 1 of the hepatic encephalopathy.
Now we'll move to Professor Ayaz Gambhir. Professor Ayaz Gambhir, please make your question. Ask your question. Professor Gambhir, please. Then Professor Dr. Ojas Gupta wants to make a comment. Dr. Ojas, please unmute yourself and ask and make your comment.
Good morning, Director, sir, respected teachers. and all the dear faculties and residents. So currently in the Department of Pathology, we are doing almost all of the autoimmune markers by relevant techniques, whether it is by indirect immunofluorescence, immunoblot, or ELISA. So because they are done at a cheaper rate, because it's a government setup, so it will be very helpful for the patients wherever required. Thank you. And also we are also well equipped to handle the liver biopsy in our department. We have standardized all the special stains which are required, so the clinicians can respond as per their requirement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ojas. Dr. Madhu. And then Dr. Ojas, Dr. Shubham, you want to ask something again? How do we differentiate between sepsis-induced AKI with drug-induced AKI from hypovolemia? So, Dr. Deepak, would you answer this?
Sir,
Yes.
so the
Actually,
diagnosis
I
was made
was
that
talking to
it
Dr.
was
Ojas.
sepsis induced and the procalcitonin level was normal. So how drug induced AKI, and for the sake of practice, I'm asking how drug induced AKI and the prerenal,
Yes.
that is the patient was having anasarca. So there might be hypoperfusion of liver,
No,
kidney.
1 minute. At least
Yes,
two
sir.
important studies conducted, one on 35 patients, another on 32 patients, and there are many more in PubMed, which reveal that the positivity of procalcitonin, procalcitonin can be false negative in 20 to 25% of the cases, and the blood culture was also negative here. That is attributed to prior intake of antibiotic at district hospital before coming to us. If you see the TLC that responded to, the TLC was very high in the tune of 21,000, and along with that creatinine also raised, and both of them settled together after giving antibiotics. So it is most probably sepsis and nothing apart from it.
Otherwise, Shubham, I'll tell you a clinical guideline here. Like in hypovolemia, the extremities are cold. They're very cold. Okay. But in septic shock or endotoxic shock, the extremities, the hands are warm. They're not cold. Secondly, if you have got the facility, you can do the cardiac output. The cardiac output will be severely reduced in hypovolemic shock. But in septic shock, the cardiac output is actually increased. It's more than normal. Okay, so that's a clinical thing. We'll move to the next question from Dr. Anurag. Dr. Anurag, please ask your question now.
What is the prognosis of such patients with and without liver transplants?
I think Dr. Devesh can better answer it. Our patient also died, and the prognosis is nothing
I
but
think this question is for a resident, because Dr. Anurag himself knows what is the prognosis of these patients with or without liver transplant.
Sir, with MELD scores are greater than 32, sir, the 3-month mortality in this patient is more than 30%, sir, 33%.
I think the crucial issue here is how long the disease is reversible. When will you say that the liver changes have become irreversible? Okay, that's very crucial. So long as you feel that they are reversible, you can try medical treatment and all. But once they become irreversible, then liver transplant is the only option.
What is the survival of after liver transplant?
Actually, my question is just to emphasize on the point they have taken, that why liver transplant is necessary in these patients. So without liver transplant, the prognosis is very grim in such patients who have decompensated with autoimmune hepatitis or any autoimmune liver disease with overlap symptoms. So why liver transplant is necessary, and it is necessary on urgent basis. That's why I asked this question. Thank you.
I think I will give a final comment about the liver transplant, just 1 minute. So, what are the problems of liver transplant in our country or our setup? Liver transplant, basically there's high shortage of donors. So around 50,000 liver transplants are required per year, and only around 1,000 or 1,500 or 1,500 transplants are being done per year in our country. So high shortage of donors, and is high cost. Around 20 to 30 lakhs rupees are needed for liver transplant. And also the awareness among the general practitioners are very low about the need of liver transplant, and they refer the patient to a gastroenterologist or liver transplant center very late when the patient is not fit for the liver transplant. So high cost, organ shortage, late referral, and mismanagement of these patients by general practitioner outside. These are the basic problems in these patients in our setup. I think we should discuss about starting of liver transplant in our center also. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
And
It's
one more thing, I would like to comment that this case was very well presented from the Department of Medicine. So I congratulate Professor Deepak and Dr. Ravi for this.
Dr. Devesh as well. We took a reference and he mentored us as well. So special thanks to moderator sir and Dr. Devesh and all of you for your active participation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Anurag.
It's past 9 o'clock, so we'll finish the session today. And I especially wish to thank Dr. Ram Nivas Meena, Dr. Ishan Kumar, Dr. Deepak Gautam, and Dr. Devesh Yadav for their inputs, and both the presenters, Dr. Karthik JS from Bangalore and Dr. Ravichan from Hyderabad, and all the participants who took part actively and all who tuned in today to listen to the discussion. And before we end, we'll hear some concluding remarks from our Honorable Director, Professor Mittal, who always makes such insightful remarks. It's a pleasure hearing him. Professor
Thank
Mittal,
you, Professor Rahul.
thank you, sir.
Already concluded, both the cases very well presented. Incidentally, both from surgery and general medicine, this time cases belong to hepatobiliary, and especially first case hepatobiliary, second mainly liver. So in both the cases, transplant issues were discussed. So it is the need of the hour, and it should be explored by the gastroenterology department as well as general surgery or gastroenterology surgery division of the general surgery. Hopefully sooner or later gastroenterology, surgical gastroenterology department will also be there, and transplant is being done at lot many places, though initially when you start lot many issues come up, prop up, and donor issues as well as the later on complications. But here, as far as cases are concerned, both are well presented, well discussed. That is more important. Discussion part, well discussed. I congratulate both the units for presenting good cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll meet again on Saturday for the mortality meet. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Go.
So,